Hello, this is Elizabeth, and I am the Catholic Lady, and we're reading Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell, and we are nearing the end. I'm sorry for the long delay. I had a bad couple of months, but we're going to get this finished one way or the other. So we're up to chapter 50, and Saul has returned to Jerusalem. The great renegade has cursed us again with his presence, said the Jews of the city. The man who persecuted and imprisoned us has returned, said the Nazarenes. The troublemaker, said the priest in the temple, is amongst us again, and what will he plot now, that zealot? He admonished and repudiated us, said the young zealots and the Essenes. Though once he pretended to love us, so say our fathers. Has he returned to massacre us? Even the Roman procurator, Felix, spending the pleasant springtime season in Caesarea by the sea, heard of Saul of Tarshish, whom he called Paul of Tarsus. The news was brought to him by old soldier, who remembered Saul, and by many of the truckling priesthood. He caused grave dissension in Jerusalem and throughout Judea, said the soldiers, and his people hated him and reviled him, a Jew himself. It is he who has aroused the Nazarenes, or the Christians throughout Asia Minor and Europe itself, against the rule of Rome, said the priest. He has caused riots and upheavals and blasphemies wherever he has trod. It is whispered that he is a member of the Zealots and the Essenes, who live but to destroy. If all detest him, said Felix indolently, why has someone not murdered him before this? He thought the situation amusing and dismissed Saul from his mind. In the meantime, Saul walked the streets of his city, wherein he had not walked for many years. He lingered in the walled space where he had first seen the Messiah with his mother, and he sat on the bench where he had sat and gazed at the empty bench opposite him. He wandered in the marketplace where he had heard his name called in that thunderous masculine voice, Saul, Saul of Tarshish. He entered the temple at an hour when it was not very crowded, and stood on the very spot where he had felt the presence of the Messiah. He left the city for the wilderness, where the youthful zealots had been executed, and where Christ Jesus had comforted them, and they had known him through others, though others had not. He stood on the crossroads where he had heard the Messiah address the scribes and the Pharisees and the common people. He walked on the way of the Messiah had walked, with his cross, to the place of his shameful murder. He visited the tomb which Joseph of Arimathea had given for the Messiah's body, and from which he had risen. He went to the mount where the Messiah had ascended to heaven, and to the cave where his child mother had given him birth. And he marveled with a marveling as new as if he had just heard it, that God had actually been present on these sacred spots, had deigned to be born as a man, with all man's humiliations and animal functions of the body, with all humanity's common pains and griefs and hungers and yearnings. Saul touched the earth the sandals of Christ had touched, and said to himself, surely this is a holy place. Man himself had become holy through the holiness of his Redeemer, though he merited nothing by his own efforts. Human life was holy because one had taken on the flesh of mankind and redeemed man from sin and death. Sometimes in contemplation at these places, Saul would be seized by a rapture that held him immobile and trembling for moments at a time, and people passing would stop to stare at his illuminated face and wild, fixed eyes, and would smirk at the sight of this working man with his long tunic the color of the red earth, and his leonine white mane, and his strange appearance. But Saul, consumed by love and the passionate desire to see the Messiah again, could only think in the rapture, Oh, surely men will never forget that he lived and walked in Israel and died here, and will forever hold this little land sacred and inviolate. And there were occasions when he felt no rapture and no hope, for all about him was confusion, compounded by confusion, where men would be brothers in joy and delight, and not mortal enemies. Sometimes it seemed to him that Israel was a cup from which poured violence, bewilderment, and murder among the brethren. And surely he would say to himself, "This is the greatest of all blasphemies, for Israel was holy beyond all other holinesses, and her people prophets. That there should be contentions, rivalries, disputes, hatreds, rebellions, and betrayals in this holy land was an affront to God, who had so blessed her through the ages, and had protected her, and had given her his only begotten Son. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my eye be blinded and my right hand be withered." Saul repeated from the prophets, and his heart would swell to bursting, and his eyes would run with tears. It was growing more and more incredible to him that the new church could be rent by doctrinal disputes, narrow little interpretations, self-glorification, anger, repudiation, dissent, and quarrelings, which led to actual violence. For the way was so plain and simple. But then he would also think, we are only men, if redeemed, and we carry into the Holy of Holies our imperfections and our vices and our egotism, alas. Often we will not surrender our souls and our lives to him, to whom they belong, because to do so would rob us of the delicious sins we love so much. His soul wept for his beloved people and his beloved land, the seat of prophets and heroes, the halo of revelation, the holy mountains, the sacred earth, the land above all lands, which had been so blessed. And he remembered that the Messiah had wept also for the same country. I have been commanded to return here, he thought, yet I do not know why, for none will listen to me, either Jew or Christian, and I am accursed of both. I linger waiting. In the meantime, he played with Sephora's grandchildren and walked in her gardens and meditated impatiently and sorrowed. Then one Sabbath eve, he was urgently moved to go to the temple. He arrayed himself in his meager finery, his heart shaking, and put on his best plain sandals and his prayer shawl and his phylacteries and curled his earlocks. He came upon Sephora sitting in the atrium with her 2 grandchildren, and when she looked at him, it seemed to her that he had a grave and unearthly aspect, and she rose dumbly and stared into his eyes. He took her in his arms and kissed her forehead, and suddenly she clung to him and still did not speak, but she felt his sorrow, deep and speechless. He put her from him and left the house with his head bent, for he knew that he would never again see his sister. "Saul, Saul," she cried after him, regaining her voice, and she ran to the portico, but he was far down the street and did not answer her. The red sunset had inflamed the mountains, the streets, and the skies of the city, and it was as if a conflagration was devouring them all. Sephora could not even weep. She put her hands to her mouth, and she watched until her brother disappeared. Then she leaned against a column and prayed, and now her tears came. She began to shudder. She saw that the dull red shadows from the sky cast black shadows on the earth, and she remembered the prophecies that the temple would be destroyed and Israel rendered desolate, and it was all mingled in her quaking mind with the image of her brother and the prophets, and woe filled her heart, and it appeared to her that the whole world was burning. We'll stop here and finish in the next